see when we talk about Paul's interactions with Ephesus why I've lumped these two together. Let's go ahead and dive in and talk just a little bit about the city of Ephesus. It was built in the 10th century BCE by Attic and Ionian Greek colonists. Now, when I say Attic, what do I mean by that? It's not the room at the top of your house that's not insulated and air conditioned. These are people from Athens. People from Athens. So when you see Attic in reference to classical civilization, you're typically talking about the people of Athens. So these are colonists from Athens, and this region came to be known as Ionia, and it was a part of the Ionic Wars. It was very famous for the Temple of Artemis, which is said to be constructed around 550 BCE. And that was actually one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this area was at the heart of a lot of the history that goes on during, well, really everything from Alexander the Great all the way down to the time of Paul. Because you have the Ionian Wars, you have the Peloponnesian Wars. Ephesus is deeply involved in both. You have the wars between the Greeks and the Persians. Ephesus is right there, caught up in the middle of it, and would change hands back and forth. When Alexander died and his generals divided up his empire, they were at first under the leadership of Lysimachus, and then were taken over by the Seleucids. And they ended up being under the Seleucids, but at times the Ptolemies would exert influence or control over that part of Asia Minor. And so Ephesus was a very volatile place in a lot of ways politically. And yet it seems that the overall day-to-day life of the people of Ephesus doesn't seem to have been largely affected that much by the changing political winds. What is interesting about Ephesus is that it really is geographically and culturally at a crossroads between the Greek culture to the west and the more Oriental culture to the east. And so while you see a heavy Greek influence in Ephesus, and we'll see geographically in just a moment why that would be, at the same time it is interpreted and in terms of the ordinary lives of the people and put into practice in ways that reflect Oriental worldviews. A lot of the mysticism of the Orient is mixed in with the mythology of Greece. And there's more of mysticism in the Ephesian type area than you would find over on the Greek peninsula, for example. And so there's this crossroads of culture, there's this crossroads politically speaking throughout the history of Ephesus. And then in 129 BCE it becomes under Roman control because the king that had political control over Ephesus died without an heir and left his realms to Rome. So Rome takes over. And they begin to be in charge of Ephesus. It becomes the Roman capital of the province of Asia. Asia was a term that Rome used for this part of Asia Minor. The Greeks would not have called it Asia. They would have called it Ionia. But at any rate, it is under Roman control, of course, when Paul comes into it, but with a heavy Greek influence and that backdrop of Oriental ways of thinking. It's located on the river Cayster, which formed a harbor on the Aegean Sea. And that river turns out to be quite problematic for the people of Ephesus. We'll see a little bit more about that in a moment. Looking at the geography here, if you can see the little inset there, it shows you better where the river Cayster flows into the Aegean Sea. And if you're sitting on the front row, you might be able to see this blue line that says shoreline today, and then farther back where it says shoreline AD 60. And the reason that's there is to let us know that the river Cayster is a very silty river. And the river has brought down silt that has filled in that shoreline so that today the shoreline is a great deal further out to sea than it was in Paul's time. But that's a process that's been ongoing literally for thousands of years. And it was going on at the time of Alexander, so that when Lysimachus took over after Alexander's death, he comes back to Ephesus and he finds the city of Ephesus in the midst of a terrible plague of malaria. And the reason for the terrible plague of malaria is because the silt from the river has created marshes at the mouth of the river. And the marshes, of course, have become inhabited by insects where still water is. And it being a Mediterranean climate, all of these sorts of diseases could spread. And so malaria has spread throughout the population, and the people are dying in droves of malaria. And so Lysimachus tells them, you're going to have to leave the city. Now, again, if you can look on the map, you might see, if you're, again, on the front row, and I'm sorry, I blew it up as big as I could. There's a little red line that says Sacred Way, pointing to the Temple of Artemis. That's almost a mile and a quarter away from the actual city of Ephesus. But where the Temple of Artemis is located is actually the original site of the city. Lysimachus said, we're moving out of this swamp. And so he packed up everybody and everything, and he moved them a mile and a quarter to the southwest, and he built a new city. And just to make sure that everybody did what he said, he flooded the old city by stopping up the sewers so that the river flowed in and flooded the city. So you definitely didn't want to be there after that. And so they all moved to the new city, which he enclosed with a wall. And this wall enclosed somewhere between about 1,000 and 1,030 acres. And that became the new city. So to get to the Temple of Artemis, you actually had to hike a mile and a quarter from the new city. But that's the city that Paul would have visited during his lifetime, was the one that Lysimachus built. Now, let's talk a little bit about Paul's interactions with the city of Ephesus. The first time we know of that he comes to Ephesus is during the second missionary journey, around 52. Right at the end of that missionary journey, he stays there for about 3 months. That's recorded for us in Acts chapter 18, verses 19 through 21. Very brief stay there. And then he goes on back to Antioch. On the third missionary journey, however, he makes a point to come back to Ephesus. And he does, and he stays for a period of anywhere from 2.5 to 3 years. Paul himself describes it as 3 years in Acts chapter 20, verse 31, that he stayed with the Ephesians and he preached there. Now, you may recall from Luke's account that Paul began for about 3 months in the synagogue before he became utterly outraged with the Jews and their unbelief, and he moves his preaching to the school of Tyrannus, and he begins to preach in Ephesus there. And the Ephesian church is born. Luke also records for us that there was a great and effectual door opened to them there. And some have suggested that what Luke is saying is, not only was Paul having a good work in Ephesus, but Ephesus sort of opened the gateway for Paul to preach in the surrounding cities as well. And there were a number of cities in the general vicinity of Ephesus. And so Paul is preaching, he's having a very effective work. And then you might recall that Luke records for us right at the end of chapter 19 that there's a huge incident involving a man named Demetrius the silversmith. And Demetrius is upset with Paul because Paul's preaching, he perceives, will eradicate the religion of Artemis. And he's right, it will. And he's made his fortune on making little silver idols of Artemis to sell to people. He and a number of other craftsmen. And so they stir up a riot, which is finally quelled. But Paul sees the need to leave the city at that point and move on to Macedonia. So he does leave the city, but he leaves Timothy behind, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, because there are some things that still need to be set right in the Ephesian church. And Paul goes on to Macedonia. He finishes the third missionary journey, goes back to Jerusalem, and the rest is history. He did return before he goes to Jerusalem to the city very, very briefly. Actually, didn't even go to the city. He had the Ephesian elders come out to him in his port, and he met with them to say his goodbyes. Now, I find that interesting. I find it interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, Paul stayed at Ephesus for 3 years, which is the longest he is recorded to have stayed at any one location during his missionary work. So you can imagine that there is quite a bond between Paul and the Ephesian church. Two, it's obvious that there's a bond between Paul and the Ephesian church from the discourse that Luke records for us in Acts chapter 20, where Paul is meeting with the elders, and Luke actually records that as they part, they're weeping. And Paul's weeping. And they're sorry to be parting. He loves these people and they love him. So there's certainly a bond there. And add to that, he has left Timothy there to work with the church. Now, Paul's bond with Timothy is evident enough, I think, from the things that Luke wrote in the book of Acts. Even if we didn't have the 2 letters to Timothy, to show us the tender feelings that Paul had toward Timothy. But Paul repeatedly refers to him as his son. And not only that, in others of Paul's epistles, Paul alludes to Timothy and talks about how much he trusts him and how he's sending him on these important errands. And you can really tell that there's a close bond between Paul and Timothy, and Paul leaves Timothy in Ephesus to work with the church there. So there's very much an emotional investment in this church on Paul's part. Now, let's talk for a few moments about the Ephesian epistle. It's generally accepted that it was written from prison about the same time as the Colossian letter, the letter to Philemon. One of the reasons that we think that it's written about the same time as the Colossian letter is that if you read those letters back to back, they're almost like siblings. They're not identical, but there's an awful lot of similarity in the things that Paul has to say in those 2 particular letters. All right? Here's what's really interesting. Now, this would have been about 8 years or so after Paul had last visited the Ephesians in person. The only reference to the Ephesian people in the entire letter is in chapter 1, verse 1, in the introduction to the saints who are in Ephesus. Does that strike you as peculiar, given what we know about Paul? I mean, even writing to people that he admitted he'd never met face to face, like the Romans and the Colossians, he named a bunch of people by name. And he would add in a little blurb to this one and a little blurb to that one, and he would say, so-and-so greets you and so-and-so greets you. There's none of that in the Ephesian letter. Neither at the beginning nor at the end or anywhere in the middle. And none of the places that Paul typically would include this, there's none of that in it. That's interesting. Now, what makes that even more interesting is that in some of the ancient manuscripts, and I'm going to qualify this for you in a moment, but in some of the ancient manuscripts, the words in Ephesus are lacking. Now, I want to qualify that for you for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is by far a minority of the ancient manuscripts who lack the words in Ephesus. And number two, the critics who have made a really, really big deal out of this, frankly, make hypocrites of themselves by doing so, and I'll explain why in a second. The most notable manuscript from which the words in Ephesus is missing is a manuscript that's called P46. The letter P stands for papyrus. The papyrus fragments that we have tend to be really, really fragile compared with the parchment fragments that we have, for example. Anybody know why that would be? The material. What's parchment made from?
Animal skin.
Animal skins, exactly. And they're preserved animal skins. Okay? Parchment is made from what?
Papyrus.
Yeah, it's vegetable material. It's a reed that's beaten into a paper-like material, but with woven. It's much more fragile. It doesn't age nearly as well as parchment does. Parchment does. And so those tend to be quite fragile. However, P46 is a remarkably well-preserved papyrus fragment and considered to be, one of the really good old fragments that we have. The only problem is when you compare it with the manuscripts that include in Ephesus, you have manuscripts like Aleph. Now, if you know much about the manuscripts, Aleph is considered to be one of the most important and reliable of the old, what they call unsealed manuscripts, written in uppercase Greek. A, Alexandrinus. B, Vaticanus. That's the three big ones right there. That everybody says essentially, not everybody, let me qualify that. Many of the scholars will say if it's in Aleph A and B, it's pretty well established. It's in all three of those. D, Washingtonius. Probably the very next in line in terms of well-respected manuscripts. And I could go on and on and on. The vast majority of the manuscripts contain it. Now, we'll put an asterisk beside Aleph because some believe that the handwriting for those two words in Aleph is different than the handwriting for the majority of the rest of that manuscript. Now, here's why the people who claim that this is a really big deal make hypocrites of themselves. Because if you look at the positions these same people take on, for example, Mark 16, 9-20, they will beat you over the head with the fact that it is missing from Aleph and B, despite the fact that the page in Aleph is torn off where it would be, and B leaves a place for it. They will beat you to death with the fact that those two manuscripts leave it out, and therefore Mark 16, 9-20 doesn't belong in the text. However, both of those manuscripts and a host of the other most respected manuscripts all contain the words in Ephesus, and they say, that doesn't mean anything. Well, wait a minute, does it mean something or does it not? You can't have it both ways, right? So I would take that with a massive grain of salt. However, more interesting to me and more persuasive is the internal evidence, the content of the letter, and the fact that Paul doesn't make any personal references to a church that it's obvious that he has close personal ties to. What could that possibly suggest? One proposal, and I think it's worth at least considering, is this. The reason Paul omitted so many personal notations in this letter could be because while Ephesus was the original recipient, it was intended to be circulated among a number of the churches, which would fit like a hand in a glove with the idea that when Luke said a great and effectual door was opened while Paul was working in Ephesus, that what he's referring to there is that Paul's preaching of the gospel was not merely confined to Ephesus, but had regional impact. And if Paul wanted to follow that up with a circular letter, his purpose in doing so might very well lead him to omit what he would normally do and frequently did in his other letters, which would be to make a number of personal references that would have no application to any church other than Ephesus. Might also, and one scholar had suggested this, might also explain the absence of the words in Ephesus in some of the manuscripts. What if Paul said to the church, blank? As in, the one who stands up before the assembly and reads it aloud, as was the custom, would fill in the name of that church when he read it, and then they'd pass it on to the next. We know that Paul on occasion did intend for his letters to be circulated between churches. We saw it in the letter to the Colossians, didn't we? Remember he told the Colossians, when you've read this letter, send it to Laodicea and you read their letter? It's possible that this was intended to be a circular letter, and that's why there's not so much personal reference. Now, notice what is in Ephesians. There is a lot of discussion about the unity of the church. What was the problem in Ephesus? The Jews and the Gentiles. Jewish converts, Gentile converts. How do you get them together? There's a lot of discussion in Ephesians about everyday Christian living. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, be in subjection to your husbands. Children, obey your parents. Servants, obey your masters. Masters, don't mistreat your servants. So on and so forth. A lot of the discussion in this letter is geared toward the ordinary, everyday Christian, and it would be applicable widely to a number of churches. Just food for thought. Also, it's interesting to me that this letter is so similar to the Colossian letter. Now, one more interesting point. Marcion was a 2nd century character who, among other things, collected a canon of Scripture, a collection of inspired writings. Marcion included this letter. However, rather than the epistle to the Ephesians, he labeled it the epistle to the Laodiceans. Not really sure why. Now, he did live a lot closer to the time that it was written than we do, and it's perhaps possible that he knew something that we didn't. And maybe this same letter was to be circulated among a number of churches that would include Ephesus and Laodicea. Do we know of any other letter that was circulated among a number of churches that included Ephesus and Laodicea? We know of at least one other, don't we? The Revelation. John's Revelation was circulated among the 7 churches in Asia, which included Ephesus and Laodicea. Is it possible that this was a circular letter to the 7 churches of Asia? Potentially. Don't know. Just giving you food for thought. Be very careful how much weight you put on anything Marcion did, though, because he's known historically as a heretic who was ultimately withdrawn from for heresy. So it's also interesting to me that these same scholars that jump up and down on the manuscripts jump up and down. Marcion didn't include it. Yeah, Marcion also didn't include Matthew, Mark, or John in his canon. Okay? So take it with a grain of salt. At any rate, this is an interesting epistle, written to a place that Paul obviously had close connections with, and yet without all of the personal references that were so characteristic of Paul. Curious. I'll have to ask when I get to heaven. The first letter to Timothy. Now, there is a big to-do among the scholars that Paul didn't write the first letter to Timothy. And the reason they say is because Paul's writing is not the same in his letters to Timothy and Titus, because they wholesale kick them all out, as in the rest of his letters. Well, no kidding. The rest of his letters, with the exception of Philemon, are all to churches. Would you write a different kind of letter and say different things to an individual than you would say to an entire church? Of course you would. Your purpose would dictate as much. And so the fact that Paul uses different choices of words and phraseology in his letters to Timothy and Titus versus the ones to the churches is not determinative of anything to me. But what he does do in the letter, or the first letter to Timothy, is to give him a lot of instruction about the structure and organization of the church. Now, he tells us in chapter 1 and verse 3 that he left him in Ephesus to put a stop to some false teaching that was going on. And right off the bat, he answers the false teaching. And he talks about some matters that a great many of the same scholars, interestingly enough, who would love to discount this as a pseudepigraphal writing, that is, not the writing of Paul, but of someone else claiming to be Paul, would love to get rid of it because of certain passages that they find extremely objectionable, among which would be the latter part of 1 Timothy chapter 2, where Paul makes a strong distinction between the roles of men and women in the church. They find that very unpalatable. They would have a real problem, I would think, with Paul's qualifications of elders in chapter 3, because many of these same scholars will tell you that Timothy was the first bishop of Ephesus. Well, now wait a minute. That very letter teaches to have a plurality of elders, right? So either Timothy went completely off the ranch there and did something directly contrary to what Paul did, the same Paul, by the way, who appointed elders, plural, in every church, singular, at the end of his first missionary journey. Or Timothy wasn't the first bishop of anything, right? Secondly, Paul doesn't treat Timothy as one of the elders in this letter. In fact, he distinctly treats him as being separate from the elders because he talks about Timothy's relationship with the elders and how he's going to interact with the elders. That's an entirely different discussion than how elder interacts with elder. Okay? Timothy is